She was 7 days postpartum, still healing, still exhausted, still carrying the weight of everything she had survived. And she walked into that room anyway, a newborn against her chest, a navy blazer buttoned carefully over a nursing tank, pearl earrings from her mother, the face of a woman who had stopped flinching. Across the table sat her husband, the man who had spent 3 years making her believe she was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. The man who had opened accounts in her name without her signature, who had been living a second life while she apologized for laughing too loud at dinner. She was ready, but she was not ready for what happened next. Because at the head of that table sat a man she had never seen before, silver-haired, still, watching her come through the door. And then he saw the baby's face, and something in him broke open. What happened in that room in the next 20 minutes would change everything. Not just the divorce, not just the custody claim Derek had been using as a weapon. Everything. Because the man at the head of that table was a billionaire who had been carrying a photograph in his breast pocket for 14 months. A photograph of his dead son. And the baby in her arms had his son's face. Stay with me. Because this is not just a story about betrayal. This is not just a story about a cheating husband and a woman brave enough to leave. This is a story about what happens when you finally stop running from the truth. And the truth turns out to be something you never could have imagined. The lesson. Sometimes the thing that breaks you open is also the thing that sets you free. And sometimes the people you never expected become the ones who help you find your way back to yourself. If this story moved something in you, if you have ever stayed somewhere longer than you should have, or doubted something you knew was real, then this one is for you. Like this video, so more women find it when they need it most. Leave a comment, even just one word, because your words tell me this work matters. Share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. And subscribe, because every week I bring you a story that reminds you what you are capable of. Now, let's begin.
The alarm did not wake her. She had not slept. Nora Hartwell sat on the edge of the bed at 5:43 in the morning. The room was dark. The curtains were cream-colored linen, slightly too long, pooling on the floor the way she liked them. She had chosen them herself. That mattered to her more than it should have. Outside, a car engine turned over somewhere down the block. A dog barked once and went quiet. The city was barely awake. The world was doing what it always did, moving forward without asking permission. She picked up her phone from the nightstand, locked it, unlocked it, locked it again, set it face down. She was not going to call Claire, even though Claire had texted at midnight. I can be there by 6. Say the word. She was not going to call her mother, even though her mother had offered 3 times to drive the 3 hours from Dunmore. She was going to do this herself, as close to herself as a woman who was 7 days postpartum and walking into a divorce mediation could manage. The bassinet beside the bed held the most important thing she had ever been responsible for. Henry. She watched his chest rise and fall, the quick, shallow breathing of the very new. She counted sometimes, in the dark, even though Gail had told her it was normal. She counted anyway. 1, 2, 3. He was fine. He was always fine. He was 7 days old and already stubborn about it. She stood carefully. Everything still hurt, the particular interior ache of a body that had done something enormous and not yet recovered. She moved to the bathroom and turned on the light and stood at the mirror. Purple shadows under both eyes, hair she had washed 2 days ago. The face of someone who had been awake for a very long time and was choosing to be awake a little longer. She leaned against the sink. She was 32 years old. She had built a client list from scratch in a city where she knew no one, starting with 2 contacts and a second-hand laptop. She had survived a marriage that spent 3 years trying to make her believe she was less than she was. She had given birth in her own apartment at 3:47 in the morning with only her best friend and a midwife and her own body for company. She was going to put on the navy blazer. She was going to walk into that room. She was going to end this. The blazer still fit, barely. She buttoned it over a nursing tank with the patience of someone performing a small ceremony. She put on her grandmother's pearl earrings. She ran a comb through her hair and pinned it back simply and did not apologize to her reflection for how it looked. Authority, that was what she was reaching for. Not confidence, she was not there yet, but authority, the kind that does not require anyone else's permission. Henry stirred, not quite awake, the small animal sounds of a newborn negotiating the world. She went to him immediately. 7 days of this had rewired her entirely. Her feet moved before her brain did. She lifted him, pressed her nose against the top of his head. Warm skin, milk, something sweet that was just him. She breathed him in and felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly, the way it always did when she held him, as if he were the gravity she had been missing. "We have somewhere to be," she said softly, "but we have time." She carried him to the rocking chair by the window and fed him, while the sky went from dark to gray to the particular pale blue of early morning. She watched the light change over the buildings across the street. She thought about how many mornings she had watched light change in the wrong house in the wrong life, waiting for something to feel right. She was not waiting anymore. The diaper bag was packed. She had packed it 3 times in the past week, repacking it each time as if getting the order of the diapers correct was something she could control. The folder of documents was in her tote bag. Organized by Wade's instructions, tabbed and labeled, Henry finished nursing and fell back to sleep against her shoulder with the complete satisfaction of someone whose needs had been perfectly met. She dressed him in the small gray outfit with the snap buttons she had practiced on and off for 2 days. She settled him in the carrier, the structured one Claire had given her, the good one. She locked the apartment at 7:15. The drive was 22 minutes. She had timed it 4 times. She knew the parking structure, the floor number, the elevator bank, the way the receptionist at Wade's firm smiled when she saw you coming. She knew these things because knowing them made the unknown smaller. She turned into the parking structure at 7:41 and found a spot near the elevator and turned off the engine. She sat. Henry slept in the car seat behind her. She could see his face in the rearview mirror, the face she already knew better than her own, the slight furrow between his brows, even sleeping, the Loom Dong Teen on his left cheek. She had not known why he had that dimple. Neither she nor her mother had one. She had thought briefly about Derek's face and found nothing. She had not thought about it after that. She had other things to think about. I know what I'm walking into, she thought. I know every deflection, every minimizing phrase, every variation of the word overreacting, and none of it works on me anymore. This was not defiance. It was not performed courage. It was simply a fact, the way weather is a fact. She had stopped being afraid of Derek Aldridge sometime in the months of preparation and grief and clarity that followed the night she sat at his desk and found the credit card statement. The fear had not left all at once. It had left the way fever leaves, gradually, and then one morning she checked and it was gone. She picked up Henry from the car seat. She adjusted the carrier. She walked to the elevator. The lobby of the building was cool and marble-floored, white flowers in a tall vase near the reception desk. She pressed 12. The doors opened. Diane, the receptionist, stood up when she saw Nora come through the glass door. Then she saw Henry. Her face did the thing faces did. "Oh," Diane said. She pressed both hands flat against her chest. "He is beautiful." Henry, as if he understood the importance of a good entrance, opened his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, dark blue, unreadable, then closed them again. "His name is Henry," Nora said. She felt the warmth of saying it. The specific pride of a name chosen with care. Wade appeared at the conference room door. Wire-rimmed glasses, yellow legal pad, the unhurried manner that made you believe, at least while he was in the room, that things were going to be all right. "They're already here," he said quietly, falling into step beside her. "Derek?" "Derek and Gretchen." A pause. "And one other, his father." Nora stopped walking. "Richard Aldridge," Wade said. He came with Derek. She had never met Richard Aldridge. In 3 years of marriage, Derek had kept his father completely separate. The cold patriarch. The impossible standard. The man who had cut Derek off and never explained why, according to Derek. She had accepted this because she had accepted everything Derek told her, back when that was what she did. She had learned, in the months since leaving, that Richard Aldridge had cut Derek off because of choices Derek made, not because he was cold, because there are consequences. "Does it change our position?" she asked. "No," Wade said. She adjusted Henry against her chest, breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, the prenatal yoga breathing she had practiced alone because Derek had called the class embarrassing. "Okay," she said. She walked through the door. Derek sat at the far end of the conference table in a charcoal suit. He looked exactly as he always looked. That was the thing about Derek. The surface never changed, smooth and polished, and hollow where it counted. He looked at her. He looked at Henry. Something moved through his face that she could not name and did not try to. Beside him sat Gretchen, from the firm known for extending proceedings until the other side ran out of money. She had a legal pad and a pen and the pleasant neutrality of someone being paid to be unpleasant. At the head of the table, slightly apart, sat a man Nora had never seen before. Silver hair, dark suit, hands folded on the table. The stillness of a man who has learned that patience is its own power. He was watching the door. He was watching her come through it. Then he saw Henry. Something happened in his face. It was small, just a crack, the way a wall shifts before it falls. His hands, folded on the table, went very still. His jaw moved once. He looked at Henry the way you look at something you recognize, but cannot yet explain. She noted it. She filed it away. She sat down. The meeting began, and the man at the head of the table looked at her son's face and did not look away. "Before we begin," Gretchen said, adjusting her notepad, "I'd like to raise the question of, I don't understand why she brought the child," Derek said. He addressed it to the air between them, not to Nora directly. The technique she recognized from 100 similar moments. Speak about her as if she is not present. Establish that her choices require explanation. "My client is nursing a 7-day-old infant," Wade said pleasantly. "She is the child's sole caretaker. Shall we continue?" Derek's jaw tightened. He said nothing else. Richard Aldridge had not reacted to Derek's comment. He was still watching Henry, that same careful, arrested quality in his face, as if he were doing arithmetic in his head, and the numbers kept coming out the same way. Nora looked at the table in front of her and let the attorneys exchange preliminary documents. She would not look at Derek more than necessary. She had practiced this, not avoidance. She was not afraid of his face, but deliberate economy. She would not give him her attention until it was required. While the papers moved across the table, her mind went where it always went under pressure, to the beginning. She went back there deliberately, not because she wanted to live in it, but because the beginning held the evidence she needed when doubt crept in. And doubt still crept in, even now. even here. The habit of self-questioning does not end with a signed separation agreement. You have to keep choosing clarity. Remember all of it, she told herself, from the very start. The first time she saw Derek Aldridge, she had been at a charity gala she attended because a client offered a last-minute ticket. She was wearing a borrowed dress that was slightly too long. She was holding a glass of wine she didn't particularly want. She was thinking about a campaign draft she had left unfinished. He crossed the room to talk to her. Not to the women in couture, not to the women who knew exactly how to laugh at precisely the right volume. He walked past all of them and stopped in front of her. She had thought, why me? She understood it now. She understood it completely. She had been the least certain person in the room. That was the answer, but at the time she thought it was fate. Dinner 3 weeks later. A restaurant she recognized from a magazine. He remembered things she had mentioned at the gala. A project, a book title, a story about her grandmother. She had thought, he pays attention. That is rare. She did not yet understand the difference between paying attention because you care and paying attention because you are building a file. They dated for 8 months. He was generous in ways that made her faintly uncomfortable. Weekends she had never experienced. Gifts arriving without occasions. She mentioned the discomfort once, carefully. I just want you to have nice things, he said. Is that a problem? She let it go. The first sign came 4 months in. Dinner with 2 of his friends. She laughed at something one of them said. A real laugh. Too loud. The kind she could not always control. Later, in the car, Derek said, you were flirting with him. I was laughing at his story, she said. You were giving him a lot of attention. She replayed the entire evening in her head. Found nothing. She apologized anyway. That was the first time. She did not understand, at 28, that apologizing for things you have not done is not the path back to peace. It is a template. It teaches the other person what works, and they remember. The proposal was everything she had imagined a proposal should be. A private dinner, a ring that was objectively beautiful, a speech that made her cry. She said yes immediately. Her mother took her hand afterward. Tell me about him, her mother said. He's successful, Nora said. He's attentive. Tell me about him, her mother said again. Different emphasis. Nora had not understood what her mother was asking. She thought she meant his job, his family. She did not understand her mother was asking whether he was kind. The wedding was beautiful. 300 people. A venue Derek chose for the photographs. She had fallen in love with a dress. Derek called it a bit much. She changed to something simpler. She stood at the altar and told herself the small compromise was nothing. The honeymoon was 2 weeks in Portugal. She stood on a terrace in the Algarve and looked at the ocean and thought, this is my life now. She had been right. It was her life. It was simply not what she had thought it would be, the first year. She cataloged the friction under adjustment period, personality differences, 2 people building a shared life, normal friction, normal adjustment. She was very good at explaining things away. She had grown up with a father who left when she was 11, and she had decided young that the way to prevent abandonment was to never give anyone a reason to go. This required getting very good at making herself smaller than the problem. Derek found this useful. The second year, the control became more visible. Her work schedule was criticized, not shouted at, never shouted at, just questioned in ways that accumulated. Her friendship with Claire was framed as time she was choosing over him. Her opinions were corrected in social settings, not aggressively, just gently, the way you correct a child who has said something inaccurate. When she brought it up directly, carefully, he said, I don't do any of those things. I think you might be misremembering. She lay awake that night, turning the conversation over. Had she misremembered? She kept a journal. She went back and read it. What she found was not misremembering. What she found was a documented record of a woman being systematically taught not to trust herself. She put the journal in the drawer and did not open it again for 6 months. By the middle of year 2, she was sleeping in the guest room 3 nights a week. By year 3, something changed. Not the marriage. The marriage continued its steady erosion. What changed was Nora. She got tired. Not tired like needing sleep. Tired the way a muscle, held under tension, finally releases. Not from choice, but from pure exhaustion. There's a clarity that comes at the end of a sustained lie. The lie becomes too heavy to carry. She had been at her desk on a Tuesday afternoon when her coworker Bet leaned over and said, "Nora, are you okay?" Nora opened her mouth to say yes, of course, just tired. What came out instead was a sound that started as a breath and became something else. Bet quietly closed the office door. "Whatever it is," Bet said, "you look like someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time." Nora sat for a moment. Then she said, "I think my marriage is over." It was the first time she had said it out loud. It felt, strangely, like setting something down. Not the grief of setting it down, just the relief of putting it somewhere other than inside her chest. At the conference table, Richard Aldridge shifted. He was still watching Henry. Nora noticed again the precision of that attention. This was not the polite curiosity of a man who had never been around babies. This was something else, something particular and focused and almost afraid. Henry made a small sound and burrowed slightly against her shoulder. She adjusted him, pressed her lips briefly to the top of his head. She looked up and found Richard Aldridge watching her do it. He looked away quickly, but not before she saw his expression. Recognition, she thought. She did not yet know what he was recognizing. But she would. "The question of the child's paternity," Gretchen said, setting her pen precisely on the legal pad, "is something our client would like to address directly." Nora looked up. Derek had been waiting for this moment. She could see it in the way he straightened slightly. The specific posture of someone who believes they hold leverage. "My client has a birth certificate establishing her as the child's mother," Wade said. "The question of paternity is one we are prepared to address with documentation." "Our client's name is not on the birth certificate," Gretchen said. "My client exercised her legal right to omit any name pending this proceeding." This had been Wade's advice. She had followed it. Derek's name was not on Henry's birth certificate. No name was. She had left it blank and waited. Derek leaned forward. "The child is my son." He said it to the room, the specific way he said everything, as if announcing facts about objects he owned. "You can request a paternity test," Nora said. He looked at her. That was the first time in 40 minutes that he had looked directly at her. "We were married," he said. "The child was born during the marriage. The legal presumption, my client consents to voluntary testing," Wade said. "Are you prepared to do the same?" A pause. She watched Derek calculate. She had learned his calculating pauses over 3 years. The slight movement of his eyes, the almost imperceptible delay before the next words. He was doing arithmetic about leverage. Richard Aldridge spoke for the first time. "Take the test." The room went quiet. He said it without raising his voice. He said it the way people say things they have already decided, without heat and without urgency, as settled fact. "Richard," Derek began. "Take it," Richard said. That was all. Something moved through Derek's face, resentment, buried quickly. "Fine," Derek said. "We'll proceed with voluntary testing." And Nora sat with Henry against her chest and felt the ground beneath this meeting shift in a direction she did not yet fully understand. Denver, 14 months ago. She had gone to the conference alone. Derek had known she was going. She attended every other year. He had managed to frame it as abandonment anyway. 3 days, he said. I'll manage. The way he said manage carried the weight of considerable suffering. She drove to the airport with the windows down. That feeling, the specific lightness of motion alone, without having to monitor anyone else's temperature. She put on a playlist from college. Songs Derek called adolescent, and sang along to 3 of them before feeling self-conscious enough to stop. The conference hotel was large and slightly impersonal. She found her room, lay on the bed for 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling, and recognized the feeling. Relief. She had been relieved to be in a neutral space where nothing she did was someone else's problem. The first day was panels and sessions and the familiar rhythm of professional conversation. She was good at this. She talked to clients, made notes, moved through the rooms with the particular competence of someone who knows their field. She had forgotten, in the accumulated weight of the marriage, that she was actually good at what she did. Derek had found ways to create doubt about this. Small comments, redirected attention, the drip of undermining that is hard to point to and impossible to ignore. At the conference, she remembered, she was good. People listened when she spoke. She went to the hotel bar on the second night for a glass of wine before bed. She sat at the far end of the bar with her phone open to the Notes app. Do those actually work? Someone said. Taking notes after the fact? She looked up. The man, roughly her age. Dark hair, slightly unruly. Not the studied put-together of Derek. More like someone who had dressed reasonably without thinking about it. A pleasant face, the kind that looked better the longer you looked at it. Usually, she said, or I convince myself they do. He smiled. He sat 2 stools away, not too close. Grant, he said. Nora. They talked for 2 hours. She did not realize it had been 2 hours until she looked at the time and felt a small shock of surprise. He was easy to talk to in a way that felt like remembering something rather than discovering it. As if this kind of conversation, easy, honest, curious on both sides, was one she had known was possible and simply had not had access to for a while. He did not compete. He did not redirect. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He disagreed with her once about something genuinely inconsequential, a question of strategy in a case she described, and the disagreement felt like respect, like he was taking her seriously enough to push back. She had not realized how much she had missed being taken seriously. She went to bed at midnight and fell asleep quickly. The third day was busy. She saw Grant briefly in a conference hallway. He raised one hand, she smiled, and thought, that was it? A pleasant evening, it ends there. That night, she was in the hotel stairwell on the 3rd floor because the reception was better there. She needed to call Derek back. He had called twice during afternoon sessions. Both went to voicemail. The call lasted 11 minutes. He told her, in that controlled, quiet voice that was its own kind of pressure, that she had not responded quickly enough, that he was beginning to wonder about her commitment, that she needed to think about her priorities. She sat on the concrete stairs for 4 minutes after the call ended, not crying, doing something adjacent to crying, holding herself together in a space that was not hers, in a city that was not hers, at the end of a phone call that had made her feel like a problem. The stairwell door opened. Grant looked at her, at the phone in her hand, at her face. I can go, he said immediately. No, she said. I'm fine. He sat down on the stair 1 step above her, not beside her, 1 step above, which was somehow less intrusive. He left space. He understood that space was what she needed, and then he said, You don't have to be fine. She laughed. It came out ragged. I know, she said. They sat in that stairwell for 20 minutes. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not offer solutions. He did not push. He simply stayed in a concrete stairwell under fluorescent light while she put herself back together. He occasionally said something that made her laugh. Small, dry observations about the conference, about a particularly bad keynote, about the hotel elevator that made a sound like a large animal in distress. It was the most useful kindness anyone had shown her in years. They had dinner that night at a small Italian restaurant 2 blocks from the hotel. She told him, in careful terms, that her marriage was not what she had hoped. He listened. He did not say anything prescriptive. He did not offer advice she had not asked for. He said, "You sound like someone who already knows what they need to do." She nodded. "That's terrifying," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She did not pretend it wasn't. They walked back to the hotel after midnight. At the elevator, they stood in the lobby for a moment. The particular pause of 2 people at an ending, neither moving. She kissed him, brief and certain. She had not planned it. It came from somewhere clearer than planning. He looked at her afterward with an expression she had not seen on anyone's face in a long time, like he was actually seeing her, not managing her, not assessing her, seeing her. "I'll call you," he said. She gave him her number. He texted the next morning early. "Safe flight home. I'll call when I'm back in the city." She texted back, "Safe travels." She waited. He did not call. She told herself, he changed his mind. You misread something. You were vulnerable, and you wanted something to be there, and you invented it. She had accepted this because it was the explanation that required the least grief. She had not known, in those weeks of silence, that his phone had burned in a field in Colombia, along with a small charter plane and 4 other people. She had not known there was nothing personal about the silence at all. Back in the conference room, the attorneys were exchanging documents, numbers moving back and forth across the polished table like chess pieces. At the head of the table, Richard Aldridge shifted. He was still watching Henry. And something in the way he watched, the specific quality of that attention, made Nora look at him more carefully. This man is not here to support Derek, she thought. He was never here for Derek. She filed this away. She did not know yet what to do with it, but she filed it, carefully, in the place where clear things live. The question of financial disclosure, Wade said, placing a document in the center of the table, is something my client has prepared extensively. Gretchen picked up the document. She turned the pages with the practiced ease of someone looking for the weak points. Nora looked at the numbers and felt something steady move through her. She had found the first real evidence on a Tuesday evening in late November. Henry had not yet been born. She was 5 months along. And she had come home from work early because of the particular exhaustion that hits mid-pregnancy without warning and cannot be argued with. Derek was not home. She had gone upstairs to lie down. On her way past his home office, the door was half open. She was not in the habit of going in. She had never been in the habit of going in. The statement was face up on the desk, half covered by a folder. The number at the bottom caught her eye the way large numbers always do. She stood in the doorway. Then she walked in and picked it up. $42,000. 1 month, a card she had not known existed. She stood there for a long time. She was not a paranoid person. She had told herself this for 3 years as a reason not to look. She was not the kind of wife who went through her husband's things. She was trusting. She was not suspicious. She had understood, in the way you understand something you do not want to understand, that this had been foolish. She sat down at Derek's desk. She began to look. What she found in the next 2 hours was everything she had been convincing herself was not there. The card was 3 years old, opened 2 months into their marriage, statements showing restaurants she had never been taken to, a hotel in the city, on dates she had been told he was working late, a travel agency booking for a trip she had never known about. The charges consistent enough over 3 years to constitute not a mistake, but a system. She sat at his desk and felt something she would later identify as the specific sensation of a lie ending. Not a dramatic collapse, just a quiet settling, the way a house sounds when it finally goes still. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. The thought moved through her in a low, declarative voice, like something being confirmed rather than discovered. I was not imagining things. I was not overreacting. I was right every single time I felt something was wrong. She put the statement back where she found it. She went downstairs. She made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. She did not cry. She sat with the knowledge for a full evening, turning it over, looking at it from every angle, making sure she understood its shape before she did anything with it. The next morning, she called Claire. I need to tell you something, Nora said. I know, Claire said. I haven't told you yet. I know, but I've known something was coming for a long time. Claire drove over that evening. She brought soup. She sat on the kitchen floor. She had always maintained that floors were better for serious conversations. And Nora told her everything. Claire listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, Claire was quiet for a moment. How long have you known something was wrong? Claire asked. Since year 2, Nora said. How long have you been afraid to find out for sure? Since year 2, Nora said. Claire took her hand. She did not say, I told you so. This was one of the things Nora loved most about her. What do we do? Claire said. I need a lawyer, Nora said. Before I change anything, before I say a word to him, I need to know exactly where I stand. She found Wade Cooper through Bet, whose sister had used him in a custody case. She met him the following week while Derek was at work. She brought photographed copies of the statement and a list of questions she had written over 4 sleepless nights. Wade listened to everything without expression. Then he said, Tell me about the financial structure of your marriage. What she found out in that meeting was worse than the credit card. Derek had taken out a second mortgage 18 months earlier without telling her. He had opened a joint account in her name, without her signature, through means that would later come back to interest the banking board, and used it to route money in ways designed to leave her holding a portion of his debt. She sat in Wade's office and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief. Something older and simpler, a weariness that had been accumulating for 3 years and had finally found its proper name. He was going to let me carry his debt, she said. It appears that way, Wade said carefully. She was quiet. I deserve better than this, she said. Not a question, not a plea, a declaration. The kind that comes from somewhere below the fear, from the part of you that has always known its own value, even when you have been carefully taught to doubt it. Wade looked at her over his glasses, the look of a man who agreed completely and was too professional to say so. She began the formal separation 3 days later. The confrontation with Derek came a week after that. She had not planned it. She had planned to simply let the papers do the talking. But Derek had come home and found the guest room emptied and knocked on the door in a way that was different from his usual knock. She opened the door. She looked at his face, the face she had studied for 3 years, the surface that never changed. I know about the accounts, she said. I know about the card. I know about the hotel. I know about the trips. His expression did not break. It shifted, like a chess player, repositioning. What trips? He said. She had known he would say this. I'm not doing this, she said. I'm not having the conversation where you tell me I'm wrong about what I found with my own eyes. I'm done with that version of this. You're overreacting. No. Her voice was even. I'm not. I haven't overreacted in 3 years. I've underreacted. I've explained things away and apologized for things that required no apology. I am done with it. He stared at her. Something moved through his eyes. What it was, she could not name. It moved too quickly. You're pregnant, he said. I am? You're not going to do this right now. You're pregnant. I'm going to do this exactly now, she said. My pregnancy has nothing to do with it. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs until they stopped. The hardest part, she thought, is admitting I knew all along. And the part after that, the part no one tells you about, is forgiving yourself for how long it took. At the conference table, Gretchen challenged a line item in the financial disclosure. Wade responded with quiet precision. Richard Aldridge had not looked away from Henry in 14 minutes. Nora looked directly at him. He seemed to feel it. His eyes moved from Henry to her face. They looked at each other for a moment. He cleared his throat. May I? He looked at Henry, then at her. May I look at him more closely? The room went still. She looked at Wade. Wade gave the smallest shrug. Your call. She leaned forward, angling Henry toward the man across the table. Richard Aldridge looked at her son's face from 3 feet away. His jaw moved once. His hands pressed flat against the table's edge. How old is he? Very carefully. 7 days, she said. And when? A pause that had been carried a long time. When was he conceived? Richard, Derek's voice, sharp. Be quiet, Richard said. Derek went quiet. Richard looked at Nora. I apologize for the personal nature of this question. I would not ask if it were not important. She studied his face for a long moment. This man is not my enemy, she thought. I don't know what he is, but he is not that. 14 months ago, she said. Approximately. Richard closed his eyes. When he opened them, something in them had changed. A decision had been made. She could see it clearly. I would like to take a brief recess, he said. The recess lasted 20 minutes. Nora stood at the window at the end of the hall, Henry in the carrier against her chest, the pale morning light making a rectangle on the floor. Wade stood at a respectful distance. What just happened? She asked. I don't know yet, he said. He recognized something in Henry's face. Wade was quiet for a moment. Yes, I think he did. She looked out at the street, 12 floors below, a delivery truck. A man with a dog stopped at a trash can. The city going about its complete indifference to any particular crisis. She had always found the indifference comforting. The world keeps moving, and that means there is somewhere to move to. Whatever this is, she thought, Derek did not plan it. The way Derek looked at his father was not planned. Richard did not come here to support Derek. Henry shifted against her. She thought about the night he was born. She had been alone in the apartment. 3 in the afternoon, a Saturday, 8 days before the divorce meeting. Her feet elevated on the couch. A documentary she was not watching. Then the first contraction. She noted it the way you note the first raindrop. So, that's that. She called Gail. First contractions. Note the time. Eat something light. Call me back in an hour. She called Claire. I'm getting in the car right now, Claire said, before Nora finished the sentence. She texted Derek. Not called. Texted clinical documented. Labor has started. Will update as needed. He did not respond. He would call 2 days later to say he had been traveling with no reception. This was possible. It was also exactly the kind of explanation she had spent 3 years accepting and had recently stopped being able to. Claire arrived at 5:30. Gail at 6. The 3 of them moved through the apartment in the rhythm of active labor. A choreography she had not known she knew until she was in it. She walked. She stood in the shower until the hot water ran out. She breathed the way she had practiced alone in the prenatal yoga class Derek had called embarrassing. Sometime around 9 o'clock, she found herself on the bathroom floor. She was not sure how she got there. Time had gone strange. She was sitting with her back against the tub, fully dressed in the yoga pants and sweatshirt she had been wearing all day. The tiles were cool under her. The light was the pale, honest light of a bathroom at night. She could see the grout between the tiles, the small plant on the windowsill she had remembered to water every week. The hand towels she had chosen herself. This is my bathroom, she thought. I chose every single thing in it. Claire sat down beside her on the floor. No fuss, no performance of comfort. She just sat. Do you want to talk? Claire asked. No, Nora said. Okay. They sat on the bathroom floor in the quiet. Nora breathed. Contractions came and went like weather. Between them she felt, underneath the physical reality of what her body was doing, something she had not expected. Not fear. Purpose. She was bringing a person into the world. In her apartment, in her bathroom, on her terms. She had not chosen the circumstances that led here. She had not chosen 2 years of quiet erosion, or a husband who opened accounts in her name, or the divorce she was navigating 8 months pregnant. She had not chosen any of that, but she had chosen to leave. She had chosen Wade and Gail and Claire in this apartment, and the cream linen curtains, and the plant on the windowsill. She had chosen. A contraction came, and she breathed through it, and when it passed, she thought about Denver. She let herself, on the bathroom floor at 9 o'clock in the night, think about Denver. She thought about a hotel stairwell, and a man sitting one step above her, who understood that space was the kindest thing he could give. She thought about a dinner that felt like remembering. She thought about the specific expression on his face at the elevator. Not desire, exactly, something quieter. Recognition, like he had been looking for something and found it. He said he would call, she thought, and then he didn't. She had spent 14 months filing this under rejection, under misreading, under the category of things you tell yourself about when you are lonely and vulnerable and want something to be real. But it had been real. She knew that. Even on the bathroom floor at 9 o'clock in the night, she knew it had been real. She just did not know yet why the silence had come. She breathed. Claire held her hand. Henry arrived at 3:47 in the morning. She had moved to the bedroom by midnight with Gail's direction. Propped up against pillows, the room dim and warm, Claire on one side, Gail at the foot of the bed. Push, Nora, Gail said quietly. You've got this. One more. And then a cry. Such a cry. She had been told about this. She had read about it. Other women had tried to describe it and found that language bent under the weight of it. She understood now why it bent. The specific way her body responded to that sound moved through every system she had, bypassed her brain entirely, went somewhere older, something that had no name except maybe yes, maybe there, maybe this is what I was made for. Gail placed him on her chest. She looked at his face. She said, "Oh." Just that. Just, oh. He was pink and furious. Dark hair flat against his head, hands and fists. He had arrived angry at the world, which she would later decide was a personality trait and not a criticism. She pressed her lips against his temple. She felt her entire life reorganize itself around him, permanently, without asking. "Hi," she said. "Hi, I've got you." He stopped crying. She did not understand why he stopped. She would learn later that a mother's voice could do that the sound he had heard for 9 months could organize the chaos of a new world into something recognizable. She did not know it then. She only knew that he went still and blinked at her with dark, unfocused eyes, and she thought, I will walk into any room for you. I will not flinch. She named him Henry Grant Hartwell before she fell asleep at 5 in the morning. Henry for her grandfather, a quiet, steady man she had loved without complication. Grant because it had seemed right in a way she did not try to explain. She fell asleep with him against her chest and Claire's hand on her shoulder and the pale light of dawn coming through the window she had left uncovered. In the hallway of Wade's law offices, the side room door opened. Richard Aldridge came out first. His face had changed. The quality of a man who has made a decision and is moving through it. He walked to where she was standing, Mrs. Hartwell, even, careful. I would like to speak with you privately, before we return to the room. She studied him. Not my enemy, she thought again. My attorney should be present, she said. Of course. 3 minutes, she said. The small side room had a round table and 4 chairs and a plant in the corner that needed water. A neutral space, the kind used for conversations too significant for a conference room and too quiet for a lobby. Richard Aldridge stood at the window. He was holding the coffee the receptionist had brought. He had not drunk from it. He looked out at the street below for a long moment, then he turned. I have a son, he said. Had 2 sons. Nora was still. Derek said. He looked at her steadily. And Grant, my younger son. Grant died 14 months ago. A plane crash in South America. He was 34 years old. The room was very quiet. She felt something shift behind her sternum. Not pain, not yet. Recognition. The specific sensation of a door opening. 14 months ago. Grant was... Richard paused. Something controlled in his face. Controlled the way men of his generation learned to control things. He was different from Derek. He was the kind of person who sat with strangers in hotel stairwells. Nora's breath went shallow. I found that out later, Richard said. From a colleague who had seen him do it. He did things like that. It was simply his nature. She could not speak. The dimple, Richard said. Your son has a dimple on his left cheek. Grant had one on his left cheek from birth. He paused. I used to put my finger on it when he was a baby. He stopped. Pressed one hand flat against his thigh. I apologize for what I'm going to say next, Mrs. Hartwell. I understand it may be painful. Tell me, she said. Her voice was steady. She did not know how. I believe your son is my grandson. Grant Aldridge. She sat with the name. She had known him for 3 days. She had known his first name and the warmth of his laugh and the way he listened. The way he sat one step above her on concrete stairs and understood that space was a gift. The way he said, you don't have to be fine, and meant it entirely. She had not known he was a billionaire's son. She had not known he had died 3 days after they parted. She had not known the silence was not rejection, had never been rejection. She pressed her hand against Henry's back. Her son, Henry Grant Hartwell. He had his father's dimple. Do you have a photograph? She said. Richard reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. A man who had carried his dead son's photograph in his breast pocket for 14 months. Not for this meeting. He could not have prepared for this meeting. He carried it because he always carried it. He slid it across the table. She picked it up. A man younger than the one she had imagined somehow. Laughing at something off camera. Dark hair, a smile with a dimple on the left cheek. She looked at it for a long time. She had not invented anything. She had not misread anything. He had meant to call. He had been killed before he could. She sat very still and let this truth move through her in the way truths do when they have been kept waiting too long, not gently, not gradually, but completely and all at once. He had not abandoned her. He had died. She looked at the photograph. She thought, "This is who you came from. You came from someone good. I see it," she said quietly, in his face. Richard's eyes went bright. He did not cry. He was a man who had learned, somewhere in 64 years, not to cry in rooms with other people, but his eyes were bright. "Yes," he said. She looked at Henry. He was awake now, regarding the ceiling with the solemn attention of the very new, discovering the world one corner at a time. She thought about the name she had given him, Henry Grant Hartwell. She had given her son his father's name without knowing it was his father's name. "Grant," she said softly, not to Richard, to the air, to the baby, to the space between what had been lost and what was here. "He didn't know," Richard said. "About Henry. He left for South America the day after the conference. The plane went down 2 days into the trip. His phone was never recovered." He paused. He had mentioned, before he left, that he had met someone. He said it carefully. The way he said things, he was protecting. She thought about a text message, safe travels. She thought about a number going unanswered. She thought about 14 months of believing she had been foolish. She breathed. "What are you asking me?" she said. "Nothing," Richard said immediately. "I'm not asking you for anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you something you had a right to know." He looked at Henry. "I would like to know my grandson, on whatever terms you decide. I make no demands. You owe me nothing." She looked at this man. She thought about everything Derek had told her. The cold father, the absent patriarch, the villain in every story. She looked at a man who had driven to a divorce mediation meeting with his dead son's photograph in his breast pocket, who had sat quietly for 40 minutes watching a baby breathe, waiting to be certain before he spoke. "He was kind," she said. "Grant, he was the kind of person—" She stopped. "He was genuinely good." "Yes," Richard said, "he was." They sat in the small room in the coffee-scented quiet. Then she said, "Tell me about him." Richard put his hands flat on the table. He began. He spoke for 2 minutes. A sketch only, but a real one, where Grant had grown up, what he had studied, the quiet way he had moved through the world, a different person than the son she had married, a different set of choices. A person who had grown up in the same household as Derek and emerged entirely opposite in every way that mattered. She listened. She held Henry. She looked at the photograph. "This is who you come from," she thought, "part of what you are." When the 2 minutes were up, Wade cleared his throat gently. She handed the photograph back. Richard held it a moment before returning it to his breast pocket. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "I'll need time to understand all of this. I don't know yet what it means legally or otherwise." "Of course," he said. "But—" She looked at him steadily. "I'm glad you came today. I'm glad Henry knows your face." Richard looked at her son one more moment. Then he looked at her. The expression she had been trying to name since he walked into this meeting finally resolved itself into something she recognized. Gratitude. Pure and uncomplicated. The gratitude of a man who had driven here, not knowing what he would find, and had found something he had not dared to hope for. They walked back into the conference room. Derek looked at his father the moment they came through the door, a suspicion moving through his eyes. The specific look of a man who understands the ground has shifted and cannot yet determine how far. "Well, assent," he said. Richard sat down. He folded his hands on the table. "I'd like to change the scope of this meeting," he said. Derek stared at him. Gretchen had gone still in the particular way of attorneys when they recognize a room has changed its shape entirely. "The child is not Derek's," Richard said. "She is prepared to submit to voluntary testing, as agreed. I believe the testing will confirm this." "You don't know that," Derek said. "The child has Grant's face." Richard said it flatly. His dimple, his coloring, Grant's face. A silence moved through the room. Grant has been dead for over a year, Derek said. Yes, Richard said. And the child is 7 days old. Conceived approximately 14 months ago. He paused. Do the arithmetic. Derek looked at Nora. The performance of composure dropped. What was underneath was not grief. She looked for grief and did not find it. What she found instead was the specific calculation of a man whose leverage point has just been removed. You were with Grant, he said, at the conference. I met your brother, she said quietly. I didn't know who he was. I knew him for 3 days. Something moved through Derek's face. The complexity of it was real. She gave him that. Resentment. And underneath the resentment, something that might have been, briefly, actual pain. Derek had grown up next to Grant, next to someone who appeared to be the better version of what they were both trying to be. That was a specific kind of suffering she could acknowledge without excusing anything that came after. She did not feel sorry for Derek, but she noted it. This changes our position significantly, Gretchen said to Derek, very quietly. Derek said nothing. The custody claim, Wade said carefully, was premised on the legal presumption of paternity within the marriage. Voluntary testing will remove that presumption. He has no relationship to this child, Richard said, flatly. That's not for you to decide, Gretchen began. You're right, Richard said. It's for a court. I expect the court will find that a man with no biological connection to a child, who is the subject of divorce proceedings initiated by the child's mother, has very limited standing regarding that child. He paused. I may be wrong. I am not usually wrong. Derek pushed back from the table. You came here for this, he said to his father. You knew. I suspected, Richard said. There was no way to know without coming. You came to undermine. Derek. His father's voice was steel and quiet. Stop. Derek stopped. Nora watched them, 30 years of damaged history in the air between them. She thought about what Grant had been and what Richard had described and what it must have cost to grow up beside that, next to someone for whom goodness came easily, and never find the same thing in yourself. Not an excuse, but a piece of information. She filed it away. What I want to address, Richard said, returning to the center of the table, is the matter of the financial accounts opened in my daughter-in-law's name without her knowledge. Gretchen's pen went still. One of those accounts was opened through a referral from my firm's banking relationship, Richard said. That means my name is tangentially connected. That means I have a direct financial interest in the resolution of this matter. He looked at Gretchen. I expect you'll find that simplifies certain discussions. Gretchen looked at her client. Derek was staring at the table. Richard turned to Nora. I am not here to manage this outcome for you, he said. That is your attorney's role. I am here because I had information you deserve to have, and because I have an interest in my grandson's welfare. A pause. Any support I offer to my grandson and his mother will be entirely separate from this proceeding. It carries no conditions. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? She said. You don't know me. I know that my son saw something in you worth sitting in a hotel stairwell for, Richard said. And I know that the child in your arms has his face. That is enough for me. She thought about the word enough, about what it meant to be offered something without conditions, without a hidden cost, without the careful tracking of what had been given and what was owed. She had lived so long in an environment where warmth had a price, and kindness had a hook that she had almost forgotten this was not a universal law. She looked at Henry. Your grandfather carried your father's photograph in his breast pocket for 14 months, she thought. He drove here not knowing what he would find and stayed quiet for 40 minutes, waiting to be certain. That is who you come from. That is part of what you are. She held her son a little closer. "What do we need to do to move forward?" she said to Wade. Wade opened his legal pad. The meeting continued. Derek said almost nothing for the remaining 40 minutes. He was a man who had entered the room with leverage and left without it, and the specific kind of humiliation this created in him was visible and real. She did not take pleasure in it. She observed it. Starting over feels impossible, she thought, but staying was always worse. I knew that. I knew it the whole time. It just took me a long time to believe what I knew. At some point, Derek looked at her from across the table. The charcoal suit, the careful composure beginning to fray at its edges. She looked back. She felt nothing dangerous, no heat, no fear, something older and flatter. The clear-eyed recognition of someone you once loved the idea of and now simply see accurately. She nodded once. She looked away. She drove home at noon. Henry slept through the drive with the completeness of someone who had deployed all his opinions for the day and required recharging. She kept the radio off. She drove through the city in the particular quiet of a person decompressing after sustained tension. She thought about almost nothing. This was deliberate. She had learned to give herself the drive. Back in the apartment, she laid Henry in the bassinet and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The apartment was quiet. The cream linen curtains made the afternoon light warm and indirect. She stood at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea and looked at the street below. Grant Aldridge. She sat with the name. She had spent 14 months calling the silence rejection. 14 months filing it under the category of things she had wanted to be real that weren't. 14 months of you misread something. You were lonely and vulnerable, and you invented a connection. She had not invented it. She set down the mug. She opened the kitchen junk drawer. The one with the batteries, and the rubber bands, and the pen that had been rolling around loose for weeks. She took everything out, wiped the drawer clean with a damp cloth, sorted the batteries by size, put the rubber bands in a small container, capped the pen, and put it where pens belonged. She was not thinking while she did this. She was processing. She moved to the pantry. She did not alphabetize anything. That was not the point. The point was touch, the weight of a can of tomatoes, the smooth curve of a glass jar, the domestic reality of her own life, the one she had built, the one that was already here and already hers. She rearranged the cans by height. She consolidated 2 half-full bags of pasta. She threw away a jar of something that had been there since before Henry. Small things, all small things, but they were hers. She went to check on Henry. He was not quite awake. She sat in the rocking chair and waited and looked at his face, his father's face. She let herself grieve Grant the way she had not let herself grieve him in 14 months. Not the grief of a great love. She would not romanticize what had been 3 days and a stairwell and a dinner and a first kiss at an elevator. That was not what they had been, but it had been real, and he had been good, and he had died before anything could become what it might have been. That deserved grieving. She gave it the space it deserved. Not forever, not all afternoon, but a real, honest amount of time. She sat in the rocking chair and let it move through her and did not try to shortcut it. Then she breathed. He didn't know about Henry, she thought, but Richard will know, and Henry will know. And someday Henry will know what kind of person his father was. Not an absence, not a choice, a loss. That is not nothing. That is a grandfather who carried a photograph for 14 months and drove to a law office and recognized his grandson's face. That is something. Henry opened his eyes, dark blue, unfocused, looking at her the way newborns look at the face they know best, with total absorption, with the quality of learning something that cannot be unlearned. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her. Not the careful social laugh of 3 years, but the actual one from somewhere below control. She wiped her eyes. She sat in the rocking chair with her son in her arms and felt the grief and the exhaustion and the love and the impossible, strange fact of being alive and beginning again, and she thought, I will be okay. Not today exactly, but I will be okay. She was certain of this. Not because someone had promised her, not because the hard parts were over. The hard parts were not over. She understood that clearly, but she was certain the way you are certain about things you have paid for with your own suffering. You know the price, and you know you have paid it, and you know you are still here. Ni biciwantam biafstag. Claire came at 7. She brought Thai food and a card with a long handwritten note inside that made Nora cry. Before she finished reading, they ate on the couch with Henry and the bassinet between them, and Claire heard every word of it. When Nora got to Grant, to what Richard had told her, to the photograph, Claire went very still. He died, Claire said, 3 days after the conference. He didn't abandon you? No. Claire set down her wine. She crossed the distance between them and put her arms around Nora without saying anything. Nora let herself be held. He was good, she said into Claire's shoulder. He was the kind of person you want to exist in the world, the kind you want more of. I know, Claire said. I'm going to think about him for a long time. I know that too. They sat together while the Thai food cooled on the coffee table and Henry slept between them, and the evening moved quietly past the windows. What happens now? Claire asked eventually. We wait for the test, Nora said. Then we figure out the rest. She said it simply. The way you say things you already know are true. Donna came the next morning. Upstairs neighbor. Retired schoolteacher. She knocked at 9:15 with a covered dish and a matter-of-fact expression that brooked no argument. Casserole, she said. Put it in the fridge. You don't have to talk to me. You can come in, Nora said. Donna sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at Henry in the carrier on Nora's chest and said, He looks like he has opinions. He does, Nora said. He's had them since day one. Donna smiled, a specific kind of smile, the smile of a woman who has seen many things and found most of them bearable. They sat in the morning kitchen and drank their tea. The apartment was quiet. The light came through the cream curtains and made everything amber and soft. Whatever happened in that meeting, Donna said, you look different. Different how? Nora asked. Donna considered. Like someone who put something down, she said. Nora thought about that. Yes, she said. That's right. The paternity test results came 3 weeks later. Wade called on a Wednesday morning while she was feeding Henry and half watching the news with the sound off. As expected, he said, Derek has no biological connection to the child. Okay, she said. His custody claim is formally dismissed. Okay. Nora. A pause. This is very good news. She laughed. I know, I already knew. It's different when it's official. It usually is, Wade said. Derek did not contest it. This surprised her for approximately 1 minute, and then it didn't. She had watched his face in the conference room when his father spoke. She had watched Derek understand in real time that there was no version of this proceeding where he came out ahead. The custody claim had been strategy. Leverage to drain resources and extend the timeline. Without it, the divorce moved cleanly forward, more cleanly than she had dared to hope. The final paperwork was drawn up 2 weeks after the test results. She signed it on a Thursday afternoon in Wade's office with Henry in the carrier on her chest. Diane brought water. The conference room was quiet. The same conference room where she had sat across from Derek and his father and watched the ground shift beneath her. She felt the pen move across the page. 3 years leaving her hand. The pen completed its work. She sat for a moment. "Do you need anything?" Diane asked from the doorway. "I just need a second," Nora said. Diane nodded and quietly closed the door. Nora sat alone in the quiet room, with the signed papers in front of her, and her son breathing against her chest. She thought about the night she had apologized for laughing too loud at a dinner table. She thought about 3 years of making herself smaller than the problem. She thought about the guest room, the journal in the drawer. She thought about the morning she woke up, and the fear was gone. The hardest part, she thought again, was admitting, "I knew all along." And after that, the part no one prepares you for, is forgiving yourself for the time it took to act on what you knew. She was working on the forgiveness. She was getting there. I was not foolish, she thought. I was afraid, and afraid is not foolish. It is human. The foolishness would have been staying afraid forever. She put the papers in her bag and went home. Richard called the following week. His number appeared on her phone on a Tuesday morning, and she felt a small flutter of surprise. She had expected him to wait longer. "I apologize for calling before you were ready," he said immediately. "You don't need to apologize," she said. "I said I'd be in touch. I wanted to say one thing and then leave you to it." "All right. I've spoken with an attorney," he said. "There is no legal basis for me to claim any rights regarding Henry's custody or upbringing. I understand this completely. Whatever relationship I have with my grandson, if I have one, will be on your terms and your timeline." He paused. "I wanted you to hear that said directly and clearly." She looked at Henry in the bassinet. He was asleep with one fist pressed against his cheek. The same sleeping posture he had shown from his first day. She had already learned this as one of his constants. The fist, the slightly tilted head, the furrow between his brows that made him look, when sleeping, like he was solving a problem that required his best effort. He looked like Grant. She had printed the photograph Richard sent. He had mailed a copy, the physicality of it touching in a way she hadn't expected. And she had held it next to Henry's sleeping face. Same brow, same cheekbones, same dimple on the left side. "Richard," she said. "Yes. I want Henry to know his grandfather." She kept her voice even. "I don't know what that looks like yet. I don't know the right pace. But I don't want to keep him from you." She heard him breathe. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. "I want you to know something," she said. "Grant was the first person in a very long time who treated me like I was worth listening to. I didn't know who he was, but he was kind in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. Henry is going to know that. He's going to grow up knowing his father was someone good." A silence on the line. "I'll tell you everything I know about him," Richard said. "Years of stories, whenever you're ready." She thought about a small child, someday, sitting across from a grandfather and learning the shape of the person he came from, learning that his father had been someone who sat with strangers in hotel stairwells and loved vinyl records nobody had heard of, and called his father every Sunday, even during the hard years. "Yes," she thought, "that is right. That is how it should be." She went back to work 6 weeks after Henry was born. Part-time at first, then gradually more. Her clients had waited, and this surprised her until it didn't. She had been building trust for years without fully crediting herself for it. People wait for someone they trust. She had been that person. She hired Ruth, practical, unflappable, the kind of person who sends daily updates in bullet point format and whose organizational instincts made Nora feel, for the first time in years, adequately supported. She ran into Derek once, a month after the divorce was final. A grocery store. He was in the cereal aisle with a woman she didn't recognize, having an argument in the low, careful voice of two people who have been having it for a while. He looked up and saw her. She felt nothing dangerous, no fear, no hot anger, something older and flatter, like looking at a scar that is properly healed, still there, useful as information, no longer a wound. She nodded once. She turned her cart down the next aisle. She stood in front of the pasta sauce and thought. Starting over felt impossible, but staying was always worse. I knew that from year 2. I just wasn't ready to act on it until I ran out of reasons not to. She picked up a jar of marinara. She moved on. Her mother came for a week in the second month. They sat in the kitchen every morning while Henry napped and drank coffee the way they always had. Practical on the surface, deeply personal underneath. Tell me about him, her mother said one morning. She meant Grant. He was kind, Nora said. In an ordinary way, not performing it, just being it. He asked questions and listened to the answers and left space when space was what you needed. Her mother was quiet. He would have been a good father, she said. Yes, Nora said. He would have. Her mother reached across the table and covered Nora's hand with both of hers. They sat for a while in the morning kitchen without needing to say anything else. Richard came to meet Henry on a Sunday afternoon. She had chosen Sunday because it felt like the right kind of day, unhurried, low pressure. She asked Claire to be there because she wanted company, not protection. Richard arrived exactly on time. He wore weekend clothes that were clearly thought about without being formal. He had brought nothing, as she had asked. She put Henry in his arms. She watched Richard Aldridge hold his grandson for the first time. She watched his face, this man who was accustomed to controlling outcomes and had spent 14 months unable to control the largest one. She watched him look at Henry from 3 inches, rather than 6 feet. Henry looked back with the focused, uncertain attention of a baby learning a new face. His eyes moved over Richard's silver hair. His brow furrowed slightly, the problem-solving furrow. Richard put one finger against Henry's left cheek, the dimple. His breath went out slowly. "Hello," he said, very softly. "Hello." Nora sat on the couch with her hands folded in her lap and felt the world arrange itself around this moment. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way right things settle. Claire caught her eye from across the room. Claire said nothing. She just nodded. Henry was 3 months old when Nora cleared out the last box from the old house. Derek had kept the house in the settlement. She had not wanted it. The second mortgage made it more debt than asset, and she had never loved it the way she would have loved something she had chosen freely. She had taken her grandmother's dishes and her books and her kitchen tools and the prints that had spent 3 years in storage because Derek found them precious. The last box had been at her mother's since the move-out. Holiday ornaments, old photographs, a lamp she had bought with her first real paycheck 15 years ago before she knew anyone named Derek Aldridge. She brought the lamp into the apartment and plugged it in and turned it on. Warm light, the particular amber of an incandescent bulb she had never been able to justify replacing. She stood in the center of the living room and looked at what she had built. Henry was on the playmat, engaged in a profound philosophical disagreement with a stuffed elephant. He grabbed it. He lost it. He grabbed it again with the complete moral seriousness of someone for whom this was, in this moment, the most important task in the world. She had rearranged the apartment 3 weeks after the divorce was final. Not dramatically. But the furniture was now in configurations that made sense to her. The couch faced the window. The bookshelves were by the door where she saw them coming in. The kitchen table sat slightly off-center to maximize the morning light. The prints that had spent 3 years in storage were on the walls. Small things. All small things. But they were her choices. Every single one. Somewhere along the way, she thought, I became invisible. She had thought this in the middle of her marriage. at the kitchen table in the big house, feeling the absence of herself. She had become invisible to Derek because Derek only saw what was useful to him. She had almost become invisible to herself because she had spent so long managing his version of her. She could see herself now. She picked up the stuffed elephant from where Henry had flung it and handed it back to him. He grabbed it with both hands and examined it with renewed suspicion. "You've got him," she said. He looked at her, then looked back at the elephant. The lamp made the room amber and warm. Outside, the spring evening was putting the last light through the windows at an angle that turned everything golden. "This is what my life is," she thought. "This is what I chose. This is real." Richard called with the consulting offer in the 4th month. She had expected some version of it. He had mentioned, carefully, and more than once, that resources were available if she needed support. She had thanked him each time and not pursued it. What he offered was not money. "I have a consulting position," he said. "Real work. It existed before this conversation, and it will need to be filled regardless of your answer. It would allow partial remote work. The client base is national. The salary is competitive. You would manage yourself." He paused. "I'm mentioning it because you're good at your work, and the position needs someone good. If you don't want it, it has no bearing on anything between you and Henry and me." She thought about it for 3 days. She called Claire. "He's not doing you a favor," Claire said. "He needs someone good, and he happens to know someone good. Those are 2 different things." "I know," Nora said. "So?" "I'm going to say yes." She said yes. Not because of Henry's future, or Richard's resources, or the complicated gratitude she felt toward him. She said yes because the work was real, and she was good at it, and she had spent 3 years being told, in the accumulative drip of small comments, that she was less competent than she was. She knew what she was worth. It had taken a while to know it with the confidence of someone who does not need external confirmation. But she knew. In the 6th month, she began to think about Denver differently. Not with the complicated weight it had carried for a year and a half. With something cleaner. She had been asked to present at a conference. Different city. And she had said yes, and then spent a week thinking about the last time she had gone somewhere alone and what had happened there. She thought about Grant on the stairs. She thought about dinner. She thought about the elevator. She thought about 3 days that had been genuinely real. He was proof, she thought, the proof that there are still people in the world who are genuinely kind. The proof that I hadn't lost the ability to recognize it. He was the proof that what I experienced in my marriage was a specific failure, not a universal condition. I needed that proof, and I didn't understand until now that the proof was still valid even after the silence. She thought about Henry. Henry, who had a dimple on his left cheek and grabbed stuffed animals with both hands, and had, in his 5 months of life, already shown something she was beginning to recognize as distinctly his: a patient watchfulness, an interest in the world that was not afraid of it. He would observe something for a long time before deciding what to do with it. He's becoming someone, she thought. I get to watch him become someone. This was not a small thing. This was, she was beginning to understand, the largest thing. Richard had dinner with them on Sundays now. She had not planned for this to become a standing arrangement. It had become one the way things do when they work, gradually, with no particular moment of decision. He sat on the floor with Henry without being asked. He let Henry pull at his silver hair without wincing. He told her stories about Grant, careful ones at first, then fuller ones as he gauged what she could hold. Grant had learned to cook at 14 to impress a girl in his class and never stopped. He had been a terrible driver and always offered to be the passenger. He had an embarrassing collection of vinyl records by artists no one had heard of that he loved without apology. He had called Richard every Sunday, without fail, even during the years when Richard had been a better businessman than father. "He was better at forgiveness than I deserved," Richard said once, quietly, without asking for anything in return. "He learned it somewhere," Nora said. Richard looked at her with the expression she had learned that was his version of being moved. She thought about what she was giving Henry through these Sundays. The thread back to a person who had been good in the specific, ordinary way that is the hardest kind to maintain. Not heroic goodness, everyday goodness, the kind that shows up in stairwells and at dinner tables and in phone calls made every Sunday even when you don't quite feel like it. It was not the family she had planned, it was the family she had. The wisdom came in the 7th month. She was on the phone with her mother late in the evening, Henry asleep in the next room, the apartment quiet and lamplit. Her mother asked how she was doing. She thought about it genuinely before answering. She thought about the year, the conference room, and the photograph, Richard holding Henry for the first time, the signed papers, the lamp from her first paycheck, turned on in her own living room. "Good," she said. "Good how?" her mother asked. "Good like—" She stopped, found it. "Good like the thing I was most afraid of turned out to be survivable. Good like everything I thought I would lose. None of it took away the things that were actually mine." Her mother was quiet. "What things?" she asked. "Me," Nora said. "Just me. I kept myself." She said it plainly. The way you say things that have been understood long enough they no longer need explanation. Her mother said, "Yes, you did." They talked for another hour. Henry's latest discoveries, a recipe, whether Nora should replace the couch or just get a slipcover. The ordinary conversation of two women who love each other and have gotten to the other side of something together. Nora sat on the couch with her feet tucked under her and a cup of tea cooling on the coffee table and the lamp making its amber warmth. She finally understood something she had been circling for months. The prison door had been unlocked the whole time, not by Derek leaving, not by the divorce, not by Richard or Henry or the conference in Denver. The door had been unlocked by the fact that fear was the only thing holding it shut, and fear is not a lock. Fear is a habit, and habits can be unlearned. She had spent 3 years treating her own fear as a reason to stay in a life that was making her disappear. She had stayed because leaving felt impossible. She had stayed because she had convinced herself that managing the problem was strength when walking away from it was the actual strength. She sat in her apartment in the lamplight with her son sleeping in the next room. She breathed. This is what spring feels like, she thought. Not the idea of spring. The real thing. The warmth after the long cold. When you stop waiting for it and just find yourself already inside it. This is it. She named her conference presentation the following spring, starting from what you have. It was not about divorce. It drew on everything, but was not about any single thing. It was about the particular skill of rebuilding from what remains after a disruption in marketing, in business, in any endeavor where the original plan has been overtaken by reality. She had expected a polite, moderate response. The room was standings only. People pressed against the back wall. She stood at the podium and looked out and felt something she recognized as the good kind of nervousness. Not the fear nervousness, the alive nervousness. The feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be. Afterward, a woman about her age came up to her. She stood for a moment before speaking, as if deciding whether to say it. How do you know, she said, when to start over? Nora looked at her. She thought about this parking garage, the phone she had locked and unlocked 3 times, the navy blazer and the pearl earrings, and the walk through the conference room door with Henry against her chest and nothing left to protect except the truth. When staying, she said, is harder than going. The woman looked at her for a long moment, then she nodded. She pressed her lips together and nodded the way people nod when they have heard the thing they needed to hear and are committing it to memory. That evening, back in the apartment, Henry sat in his high chair with an expression of total professional commitment toward whatever was orange on his tray. The lamp was on, the table was off-center. The prints she had kept in storage for 3 years were on the walls where they belonged. Her phone buzzed. Claire, how was the conference? She typed back, good, really good. She watched Henry work. He had Grant's dimple and her stubbornness and something entirely his own that she was looking forward to watching become itself over years and years of Sundays and ordinary mornings and the small, accumulative moments that make a life. She thought about Richard, who would be here this Sunday, who sat on the floor without being asked and told stories about his younger son. Slowly, week by week, filling in the shape of a person Henry would carry with him. She thought about grace, the way it comes, not announced, not earned exactly, not neat. Grace arrives the way spring arrives, not because you were good enough or patient enough, but simply because the season turned and the door was already open and you finally walked through. Henry looked up from the orange thing. He had it on his chin. His eyes were dark blue and focused. He looked at her with the expression he had been developing for months, his specific version of recognition, the particular quality of attention that said, you, yes, you are the one I know best. Hi, she said. He went back to the orange thing. She laughed. Outside, the spring evening moved the light through the windows at the angle that turned everything golden. The sounds of the street below, a car, a dog, someone's music drifting past, were exactly as indifferent to her as they had always been. The world in its great, moving indifference continued. She was inside it, solid and present. Her apartment, her lamp, her son, with his father's dimple, and her stubbornness, and his own private, slowly forming self. Her life. This is my life, she thought, and for the first time in a very long time, when she thought it, it was the beginning of a sentence and not the end of one. She smiled. The lamp made its amber warmth. Henry ate his dinner, and the evening moved forward, gentle and ordinary, and entirely, completely hers.
She walked in holding a newborn. She walked out holding herself. That is the whole story, really. Everything else, the conference room, the billionaire, the photograph in the breast pocket, the dimple on a baby's left cheek, all of it was just the universe, finding the most dramatic possible way to hand her back what she had lost, herself. And I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think there is something here that is easy to miss if we move past it too quickly. Nora did not get her life back because a wealthy man arrived to save her. She got her life back because she had already saved herself, quietly, slowly, over months of sleepless nights and signed documents and choosing, one day at a time, to stop making herself smaller than the truth. Richard Aldridge did not rescue her. He simply arrived at the moment when she no longer needed rescuing. And that timing, that beautiful, painful, perfectly imperfect timing, is not an accident in the story. It is the whole point. You have to do the work first. You have to choose yourself before anyone else can find you. There is something else this story is telling us. Something about the silence we misread. How many of us have carried an explanation that hurt us? He changed his mind. She moved on. They didn't care enough. When the real answer was simply that life intervened in a way we couldn't see. We are very quick to take rejection personally. We are very slow to consider that sometimes the silence had nothing to do with us. Sometimes the silence was a tragedy we didn't know about. And that does not mean every silence is explained this way. It doesn't mean we should wait forever for people who have simply chosen not to show up. But it means this: the story you tell yourself about what happened, the story that has been quietly shaping your self-worth, your choices, your willingness to try again. That story might not be the true one. You might not have been wrong. You might have been right about exactly what you felt, and the explanation you chose was simply the most available one, not the accurate one. The second lesson this story carries, and this one is the heavier one, is about the prisons we build from fear. The prison door was unlocked the whole time. She had been her own jailer. That line, I want you to sit with it, because I think most of us know, somewhere in the quiet of 3 a.m, that the door we think is locked is actually just heavy. That the reason we haven't pushed it open is not that we can't. It's that we are afraid of what is on the other side. Afraid of failing. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of standing in a new life with no guarantees and having to build it from what's left. Staying in something that diminishes you feels like safety, but it is not safety. It is just a more familiar kind of pain. And what Nora's story shows us, slowly, honestly, without shortcuts, is that the other side of that door is not a perfect life. It is not a billionaire who makes everything easy. It is not a neat resolution. It is a small apartment with cream linen curtains you chose yourself, a lamp from your first paycheck, a baby on a playmat arguing with a stuffed elephant, a Sunday dinner with a grandfather who sits on the floor without being asked. It is ordinary, and it is entirely yours. That is the third lesson. The life waiting for you on the other side of fear is not a dramatic one. It is a quiet one, and quiet is not the same as small. Quiet can be enormous. Quiet can be the whole world, if it is the right quiet. The quiet of a room that belongs to you. The quiet of a morning when no one is managing your mood. The quiet of sitting with your child and thinking, this is what I protected. This is what I chose. That quiet is worth everything. So if you are somewhere in the middle of your own story today, if you are still in the room with the heavy door, still trying to decide whether to push it, I want you to hear this. You already know what you need to do. You have known for a while. The knowing and the believing are in different rooms right now. That is okay. That is human. Keep working on the door between them. And in the meantime, stay. Stay curious. Stay gentle with yourself. Stay long enough to let the story unfold. Because sometimes the next chapter begins in a room you never expected to walk into. Sometimes it begins with a man at the head of a table who looks at a baby's face. And sometimes it begins with you, simply deciding that enough is enough. Either way, you are the one who walks through the door. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. It means more than you know. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by our team, crafted with intention to bring you meaning, healing, and a reminder that your story is still worth telling.